¿Aló? Dime. Oh, bueno, bien, dime.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sebastian Deck. I work with the Center for International Environmental Law, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you for this event today regarding the relevance of the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Agreement to the ongoing UN climate talks and to the COP26 expected later this year. We'll be waiting just one more minute to give a chance to all of our invitees and distinguished participants to join us. And then we'll be starting to make sure that we finish on time and we do not take longer than we had committed. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sebastian Deck. I work with the Center for International Environmental Law, and I would like to welcome you all very much. I would like to welcome all of the participants to this particular briefing that is happening just less than a week, actually, before the start of the climate negotiations next week. That will be taking place in a virtual manner. I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of all of the co-organizers. And so we would like to be expressing our gratitude in particular to the French Ministry of Ecological Transition and the Ministry of Environment of Uruguay, who both co-sponsor this event as a way to reflect the priority that they actually attach to the importance of public participation in climate policymaking. Today's event is going to be focused on two main dimensions. The first one will be hearing actually updates from the secretariats of the two legal instruments that address public participation in environmental decision making, to hear from recent developments and relevant provisions that are contained in those instruments. And then we'll be hearing from a range of panelists on how actually those provisions are relevant in the context of the implementation of the Paris Agreement and of the ongoing climate negotiations, whether starting next week in a virtual manner for the 52nd meeting of the subsidiary bodies under the UNFCCC, or towards the COP26 taking place at the end of the year in Glasgow and potentially virtually, I suppose. Just to clarify, we've invited today with the support of Earthjustice, la Ruta del Clima, the Center for International Environmental Law, and the governments of France and Uruguay, all of the states that actually have participated in one way or another in the two legal instruments related to public participation. We'll be hearing about those instruments very soon, but combined, this is more than 70 states that actually have expressed their commitment to public participation, to access to decision, to justice in environmental decision making through those regional processes. And I would like to thank in particular the 12 states that are party to the Aarhus Convention. We expect today the participation of Albania, Spain, France, Georgia, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Luxembourg, Poland, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom, as well as 10 states that have participated or have already ratified the Escazú Agreement and have confirmed their participation today. That would be Brazil, Ecuador, Guyana, Nicaragua, Peru, the Dominican Republic, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and Grenadines, and Uruguay. And we're extremely grateful for your time, knowing how hectic your agenda must be just a week before the climate negotiations resume virtually after an 18 months pause to a large extent. If you have, we will make sure that we keep this event as interactive as possible. So I will, without any additional time, I will introduce the first panelists, and then we'll make sure to keep some time for a discussion at the end. We hope to go beyond just question and answers, but really to hear from the different states participating today, actually how they see the principles that we'll be discussing today and their relevance to the climate negotiations or the domestic implementation of the Paris Agreement. We will be sharing at the end of this call the recording from this briefing with all of the participants and the other invited states that have been invited, as well as circulating a brief briefing note that actually summarizes some of the key elements being discussed today. And with approval of our distinguished panelists, we'll also circulate the PowerPoint presentations for those using PowerPoint so that you can have a further consideration for the information being provided today. Without any additional words from me, I'd like to pass immediately the floor to Ms. Fiona Marshall, who represents the Secretariat of the Aarhus Convention. Fiona is the Secretary of the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee. And in addition to this work, she has also supported the Aarhus Convention's work on protecting environmental defenders, protecting public participation in international forums, and providing legal support to the Aarhus Convention Secretariat generally. We've been having the privilege of counting on Fiona's support for a series of briefings such as the one organized today. And so we really look forward to hearing from Fiona about relevant provisions in the Aarhus Convention and relevant recent developments. Fiona, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to the Center for International Environmental Law, to Earthjustice, La Ruta de Clima, to the governments of France and Uruguay for organizing this briefing at such a timely moment, just a week before the negotiations are to begin. In my presentation today, I am going to give you a brief introduction to the Aarhus Convention for anyone who is not familiar with the instrument, to discuss its obligations regarding public participation at the national level with a mind to the NDCs and climate-related decision-making, discuss its obligations with respect to public participation at the international level with a mind to the upcoming COP26 and negotiations on Article 6, Action for Climate Empowerment and the arrangements for intergovernmental meetings, provide you with a brief update on what has been happening in Aarhus since the 51st sessions of the subsidiary bodies. And then, since it has been so incredibly dominating for all of our lives in the last year, I would like to update you with what the convention says and what the Compliance Committee has been doing about public participation during and after the COVID pandemic. So first of all, for anyone who does not actually know what the Aarhus Convention is, it is a international instrument whose full name is the Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters. It entered into force in 2001. So in October this year, it will be 20 years since it entered into force. It currently has 47 parties from across the UNFCCC region, However, it is open globally. And in October this year, at the 7th session of the meeting of the parties, we hope to welcome Guinea-Bissau as our first African party. The Aarhus Convention is the first legally binding international agreement to protect environmental defenders. And very importantly for today, the parties have obligations to promote public participation, both at the national level and at the international level. So first, I would like to talk very briefly about public participation at the national level. So the convention requires the public to have the opportunity to effectively participate in decision-making to permit specific activities which may have a significant effect on the environment, during the preparation of plans, programs, and policies relating to the environment, and during the preparation of draft legislation regarding the environment. As you might imagine, all of those different aspects are very relevant in the context of climate change related decision making. The convention's rights are granted to the public and to the public concerned as a subset of the public. The public concerned means the public affected or likely to be affected by or having an interest in the environmental decision making. And an important principle of the Aarhus Convention is that NGOs promoting environmental protection and meeting any requirements under national law are deemed to have an interest. Turning now to public participation at the international level, the Aarhus Convention contains a binding obligation on its parties to promote the application of the principles of the Convention in international environmental decision-making processes and within the framework of international organizations in matters relating to the environment. In 2005, parties to the Aarhus Convention adopted the Almaty Guidelines on promoting the application of the principles of the Convention in international forums. The Almaty Guidelines are intended to provide guidance to parties in the context of the development, modification, and application of relevant rules and procedures applied within international forums, such as access to documents and meetings and observer statements, and also the treatment of relevant substantive issues within those forums. Thinking about these substantive issues and promoting public participation at the international level in that regard. At its last session of the meeting of the parties in 2017, the parties to the convention adopted decision 6/4 on promoting the principles of the convention in international forums. In that decision, the parties agreed to focus on certain forums in particular, including those dealing with climate change, and encouraged each party to promote the principles of the convention in the procedures and work programs, projects, decisions, instruments, and other substantive outputs of those forums whose practices do not presently reflect the guidelines or the principles of the convention. With respect to the rules and practices of international forums, the Almaty Guidelines, paragraph 15, has an important reminder that where members of the public have differentiated capacity, resources, socio-cultural circumstances, or economic or political influence, special measures should be taken to ensure a balanced and equitable process. Moreover, processes and mechanisms for international access should be designed to promote transparency, minimize equality, avoid the exercise of undue economic or political influence, and facilitate the participation of those constituencies that are most directly affected and might not have the means for participation without encouragement and support. Now I would like to give you some brief updates on some of the things that have been going on in the Aarhus processes since the last briefing that was in 2019 in the context of the 51st sessions of the subsidiary bodies. So in 2020, the working group of the parties, which is the highest intersessional body of the convention, in its meeting, which was split into two parts because of COVID, encouraged parties to continue promoting the convention's principles in climate-related negotiations, in particular with regard to the carbon trading mechanisms established under the Paris Agreement. The working of the parties also recognized that more efforts should be done to further transparency and effective public participation in ICAO-related processes, such as CORSIA. Then, just recently, in fact, 2 weeks ago, at its 25th session of the working group of the parties recognized that serious efforts should be done to further transparency and effective public participation in international decision-making related to issues such as geoengineering. In March of 2021, at the meeting of the Task Force on Public Participation in Decision-Making, the task force encouraged parties to assess procedures and tools related to public participation in decision-making with a view to increasing their accessibility to vulnerable and marginalized groups. It was a particular focus of this task force meeting to explore ways to promote the participation and remove the barriers to participation for vulnerable and marginalized groups, including children, older persons, women, migrants, displaced persons and refugees, persons with disabilities, indigenous people, persons with low literacy or facing language barriers, ethnic or religious minorities, and economically disadvantaged groups and persons. The task force also noted that the COVID-19 pandemic cannot justify any restriction on the public's rights of information, participation, and justice, and that the pandemic has an impact in particular on vulnerable and marginalized groups, and it exacerbates existing inequalities and disparities. And this is a theme that has also been strongly recognized by the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee. So much so that last September, it issued a statement generally to all parties on the application of the Aarhus Convention during the COVID-19 pandemic and in the subsequent economic recovery phase. The Compliance Committee made clear that even in the case of a crisis, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic recovery phase, the binding rights set out in the Convention cannot be reduced or curtailed. Rather, if the established practices for ensuring access to information, public participation in decision-making, or access to justice in environmental matters cannot be used, any alternative means must fulfill the requirements of the Convention. On that point, one party to the Convention, Kazakhstan, proactively sought the advice of the committee during the pandemic on how it might continue to ensure effective public participation in public hearings through virtual means when there were restrictions on gatherings. And in July 2020, the committee prepared an advice to Kazakhstan, providing guidance on how it could ensure effective public participation through virtual means during the pandemic. It also made clear that the advice that it provided was for the particular circumstance of the pandemic. And once the restrictions on mass gatherings were lifted, then the public hearings should happen in person again, because it enables greater representation and it avoids the technical barriers that might happen through technical means. So that was the points that I wanted to cover with you today. the end of my presentation, when you will receive it after the session, contains links to the various items, including the Almaty guidelines that I have mentioned in my presentation. So thank you very much. And I wish you a very successful negotiation starting next week.
Thank you so much, Fiona. And I think this was extremely helpful for us to really see the depth, the level of obligations and principles that have been endorsed and actually committed to under a legal instrument by 47 countries and soon 48, actually, as you highlighted, in Europe, Central Asia, and soon Africa. And so now it really, we will be discussing in a few minutes the importance of policy coherence between all of those commitments and the decisions that are being adopted under the Paris Agreement and the work programs that are being elaborated, including next week's in the virtual climate negotiations. But before we do this, we go to Latin America and the Caribbean for an extremely exciting and promising development, something that many actors championing environmental democracy had been looking forward to for a long time. So Carlos, I will give you the floor so that you can announce to all of us this amazing and very inspirational update. Carlos José de Miguel Alonso is the head of policies for Sustainable Development Unit at the Division of Sustainable Development and Human Settlement at ECLAC, which is the Economic Commission of the United Nations for Latin America and the Caribbean. And he coordinates the Escazú Agreement Secretariat. He leads research lines on circular economy, environmental performance, and climate change, among other things. Carlos, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for all of the hard work in bringing us to this point with this fantastic news now to share that is just about a month old.
Thank you, Sebastian, and also thank you, Fiona, and the UNFCCC, because they have been very supportive in the creation of the Escazú Agreement along the whole negotiations. I will share a PowerPoint presentation as well. So just confirm me that you are watching that. You are supposed to be watching the presentation. Okay, very well. So first, I will share some information on the Escazú Agreement for those that you don't probably know. The official name of the Escazú Agreement is pretty similar to the Aarhus Convention. It's the Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a regional agreement. It is only open to the Latin American and the Caribbean countries. I'm very happy to say that the Escazú Agreement entered into force the last 22nd of April of this year, coinciding with the International Day of the Mother Earth, and this happened just because Mexico and Argentina, they deposit together the instruments of ratification 90 days before, according to the agreement. So to make this coincidence to happen. This agreement is a legally agreement, the only one that came from the Rio +20 conference, together with the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Development Agenda. This was the only legal agreement that came from that conference, and it is the first legally environmental agreement of Latin America and the Caribbean. It is also, by the way, the first agreement under ECLAC. And also it's an agreement that has been very well recognized worldwide because develops quite a lot of the specific provisions for the protection of the environmental human rights defenders. As I mentioned, it's open to the 33 countries of Latin America. 24 countries has signed the agreement, and there has been 12 ratifications, with 11 the agreement entering into force. The countries that has ratified, you have in the slide. I will not go, but Uruguay is one of them, one of the organizers of this meeting, and Uruguay was one of the first countries in ratifying the agreement. As I was mentioned, for ECLAC, we are very proud of this agreement because it's our first agreement. The other regional commissions, in general terms, they have several regional agreements, particularly the Economic Commission of Europe, but for Latin America, this is the first one. The objective of the agreement is focused on implementation. The idea is to implement the access right in the region through creation and strengthening capacities and cooperation. So it's an agreement that is focused on cooperation, and the let's say the final end is to protect the right of every person to live in a healthy environment and the sustainable development. And these two words are important because they're very related with climate change. The idea of the agreement is to balance the economic, the social, and environmental aspects in promoting the sustainable development. For us in ECLAC, the principle 10 is fundamental because precisely the asset rights are a central component for the environmental protection and the sustainable development. And we believe that the implementation of the principle 10 and the asset rights will be fundamental to avoid conflicts, to trust in decision-making processes, and also to promote better economies and a sustainable recovery now after the pandemic, because they promote transparency and they curb corruption. I would like to express that in Latin America, the situation with the COVID that Fiona was mentioned has very strong sanitary consequences, but also economic consequences. And together with these consequences, what we have seen is an explosion of illegal activities, for example, illegal logging, and an explosion again of killings and threats of the environmental defenders. And in parallel, by the way, the ministers of environment that monitor the situation has suffering of a strong budget cuts. In many countries, this has been of 40% of their budget, with the exception, by the way, of Uruguay again. And finally, for us, the Escazú Agreement and the Principle 10, it deals with the promotion of the rule of law, which is fundamental precisely to fight these illegal activities and to promote accountability. And if you see, there is a strong correlation between environmental performance and the fight with climate change, with the development of the rule of law in the countries, particularly in our region. The Secretary General sent a very nice message with the entry into force, and precisely he mentioned this agreement, this type of agreement, as a way to provide hope and inspiration to recovery after the COVID. And I would like to express that this is the type of agreement that it provides a positive agenda for the recuperation, which is fundamental for the fight against climate change. The structure of the agreement is focused on the three pillars: access to information, participation, and justice, but has a very fourth pillar well developed on human rights defenders, on environmental matters for the protection. And to support all the implementation of all the pillars, there is a capacity building and cooperation strong provisions. Obviously, the authority of the agreement is the conference of the party, but there is also a compliance committee to support the conference of the party and to recommend. It's a recommendatory body, non-judicial, non-punitive body, as in the case of Aarhus. In relation to the human rights defenders in environmental matters, the provision provides three aspects of the protection of these people: to provide a safe and enabling environment, to prevent these actions, the killings and the threats and the intimidation, and also obligations, ex post obligation, which is response, to avoid that this type of things continue to happen. Just to mention that unfortunately in our region is the most dangerous region in the world for the environmental defenders. 2/3 of the killings happens in Latin America, and this is the data for 2019, but in 2020 this has increased quite a lot, and now we are around the 80% of the killings worldwide. And the conflicts, the environmental conflicts, has increased notably because this is a region that focus their development on their natural resources. So it is fundamental for the region to protect the natural resources as a way precisely to promote sustainable development. We need the natural resources for the development, but we need as well to protect them and to well use these resources. In relation to the climate change, the Escazú Agreement also provides a provision to develop a clearinghouse with information. We have in ECLAP developed together with the parties and the civil society the Observatory of Principle 10, where there are a lot of information, including the national contributions and the laws that the countries of Latin America has developed on climate change, and the connection with the provisions of the Escazú Agreement. We believe that there is a mutual reinforcement between the Conference of the Party of Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, the 2030 Development Agenda, and the Escazú Agreement for several reasons. The first one is this connection between human rights, human rights protection, and the protection of the environment, which is also embraced by the negotiators through the Paris Agreement. The second is that the implementation of the Paris Agreement needs this transparency framework. And what promotes this type of agreements, such as the Aarhus and Escazú, is precisely access to information, transparency, and participation. So it will be fundamental. But furthermore, in the case of the Escazú Agreement, we have a specific provisions to develop environmental information, including climate change information, which is, let's say, the less developed information and data in relation to the economic and the social aspect. In particular, for example, in ECLAC, we have already signed an agreement with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States to develop climate change data and information, and also the environmental information system, which these countries, they lack of them. Also, there is provision to develop pollutant release and transfer register, which is something that in Latin America we don't have, with the exception of 2 countries, and also develop early warning system, which is fundamental for adaptation and prevention of the natural disasters. Obviously, the whole agreement is very connected with the Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, that precisely works on public awareness, public participation, and public access to information. If you want to know more of the agreement is available in Spanish and English, which are the languages of the official languages of the agreement, but we have it as well in Portuguese and in French and in Quechua, and the government of Mexico has already translated to 3 indigenous languages spoken in Mexico. And there are several documents we have developed. A particular document, which is the one below on the left, which is the relation of the Escazú Agreement with the climate change provisions in Latin America. So there is a complete document with the relation climate change and the Escazú Agreement that you can find in the webpage of the agreement. With this, I will finish, but from the ECLA point of view, these types of agreement that are instrumental because they develop ways of doing the things in the proper manner for sustainable development are fundamental if we want to curb the emissions in the region and to fight against climate change. We need to do the things in a different matter, in a different way, and obviously it is fundamental to have this type of treaties to achieve this purpose. So thank you very much, Sebastian.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for this presentation, but also for all of the work that you and many actors across the region have done actually to come to this moment when we can discuss about the implementation of the Escazú Agreement, something that is of great excitement to many actors and very inspiring also for other regions. Now, with the entry into force of the Escazú Agreement, this means that states across 3 and very soon 4 regions have legally binding obligations to promote public participation in international forums related to the environment. And so we very much look forward to actually working with states to understand what this means in the context of the climate negotiations, and particularly understand how specific agenda items that are being discussed under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement could actually benefit from being informed by the principles that have been described. And I will not repeat actually some of the provisions that build this bridge because Carlos did that already very well in his presentation. So without waiting anymore, I will give the floor to my colleague, Francesca Mingrone, who is a staff attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law and is working on linkages between public participation, climate policy, and human rights. Prior to working with CIEL, Francesca advised the Republic of the Marshall Islands on climate diplomacy. Francesca will be introducing or sharing some thoughts from CIEL's perspective regarding how actually the next weeks of climate negotiations could be used to further the principles and obligations that have been described by Fiona and Carlos previously. Francesca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Seb. Good afternoon, everybody. I would kindly ask Taylor if she can start perhaps sharing the slides. Thank you very much. I'm also conscious of time. So building upon the very insightful interventions on the key provisions in the context of the Aarhus Convention and Escazú Agreement, let's look now at the entry points in terms of procedural rights in the context of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. Next. We should definitely start with market and market approaches under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, where really the highest stakes lie. We know that the 3 pillars of Article 6, if implemented and also crafted correctly, can really help achieve substantial emission reduction. But if they are designed poorly, they actually undermine the whole Convention and Paris Agreement and also can cause significant environmental and human rights and social harms and violation. We can actually learn from shortcomings under the clean development mechanisms, under the Kyoto Protocol, where in many instances, projects that have been approved under the CDM actually led to environmental and human rights violation. So in order to avoid that and avoid past mistakes, a strong human rights-based approach is needed. That's been also suggested by the Special Rapporteur on the Environment, the previous Special Rapporteur, John Knox, the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights, who sent letters and submission to the Secretariat, really highlighting the importance of including human rights in the context of Article 6. So our key demands are around 3 key pillars that are actually in line with the standard practice of development finance. So first of all, rules governing market and non-market approaches should really ensure meaningful and effective stakeholder consultation and participation, which also includes respecting the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples from the very beginning. They should have a rights-based social and environmental safeguards. That means that projects should really respect the rights of indigenous peoples, gender equality, and having broader social and environmental safeguards. And finally, having an independent grievance mechanism. That means that they need to provide an avenue for redress if harms occur. As negotiations currently stand, unfortunately, parties are not discussing adequate safeguards and redress mechanisms. So we really encourage parties to the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Agreement to really push for effective safeguards and overall a human rights-based approach. Next. Another important entry point that is very relevant in the context of the coming SB and the COP26 is action for climate empowerment. This work stream builds around 6 main pillars, 2 of which are very relevant in the context of the 2 regional agreements, which is public awareness and public access to information. If ACE leads to a good and strong work program, which is currently being discussed and should be adopted by COP26, that would really support people-centered climate action at the national level. So to do that, we believe that, first of all, the new work program should really be rooted in human rights and be in line with the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Agreement. We also think that adopting a 5-year action plan with very coherent activities throughout a 5-year timeframe in line with other UNFCCC processes would help better implement public participation, access to information when parties implement the Convention and the Paris Agreement at the national level. And finally, establishing a task force where not only member states, but also UN agencies, civil society organizations and observers could be part of that and help promoting coordination, policy coherence and guidance. Next. As Mr. De Miguel Alonso also highlighted, when we talk about public participation, it's key to guarantee protection for those leaders and communities that speak up for the environment. And we know, as have been fortunately highlighted, that in many circumstances, environmental defenders are very exposed to human rights violations. We know, as has been shown before, that the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Agreement have relevant provisions, and also the Human Rights Council has recognized the very importance of human rights environmental defenders in promoting environmental protection, addressing climate change. Environmental human rights defenders are not addressed specifically in the context of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, but are definitely relevant across different work streams. So we really look forward to working with parties in better understanding and exploring how to really reflect the critical importance that environmental defenders play in the implementation of climate action at the national level. Next. So other than the three work streams or themes I highlighted, of course, procedural rights are relevant to a very broad range of agenda items. We've got the Nairobi Work Program, the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, Cornelian working on agriculture, etc. But also, although it's not an agenda item, the multilateral assessment and the facilitative sharing of views could really provide some good entry points to really highlight how a sound implementation of procedural rights can really leverage and reinforce climate action. I will stop there. And we're also open to further discussing this in the next 20 minutes. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you so much, Francesca. I'll give the floor immediately to a second civil society speaker who intervenes from the other region discussed today. So Adrian Martinez is the director of La Ruta de Clima. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Eastern Finland. And he's been researching specifically on matters related to public participation, human rights, loss and damage, and international climate law. He's the coordinator of the working group on ecosystems and human rights of the Climate Action Network Latin America, and will expand on Francesca's presentation, addressing how those principles discussed today can also inform the way the climate negotiations are taking place, particularly this year, given the circumstances. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastian. As Sebastian mentioned, as a Costa Rican NGO and as an active observer of the UNFCCC, public participation and access rights themselves are pretty much the basis of why can we participate at the UNFCCC and engage in the governance process. And I think one of the issues that we have to always keep in mind is the relevance that participation on one side has for the process, providing democratic legitimacy, increasing the effectiveness in dealing with an issue that is extremely complex, is multi-level, and in its scope is a planetary issue. So public participation can help us achieve both the principles of equity and responsibility of the Paris Agreement, but also the goals itself of dealing with climate change impacts and climate change mitigation and adaptation. However, when we frame participation within the UNFCCC process and in any other international forum, we have to remember that we're talking about the exercise of a human right, not only focus on the benefits that it brings to the process. And in dealing with this issue and within this mindset, it's very important for parties, as it is a party-driven process, to take actions to promote the right of public participation and enable the exercise of this right within the framework of a human right. And that is something that parties such as all of yourselves that you're here today, it's a significant task that you have within the UNFCCC to make this change happen, to address public participation as a human right. And when we talk about participation, we also have to make a leap from just opening the space for people to observe, but also to be able to be heard and influenced, which is what actually implies effective participation within the international climate governance process. So to be heard and to participate is very relevant. And this is where the inputs of civil society can provide greater benefit to parties and to the negotiation process itself. And now in the current situation with the new mechanisms of participation through virtual platforms, we have to analyze it in two different perspectives. First, that pre-existing challenges are still there. Lack of adequate regional participation has not gone away. Economic discrepancies between regions and access to participation are still there. And other barriers for participation remain, but also new ones have joined. Even though we acknowledge the need to move forward in the dialogue, we also have to become aware of the challenges that this implies. For example, there's a steep learning curve that both observers and participants have to take to access these virtual platforms. The complexity has increased on how we deal from moving from a 20,000 person dialogue into a virtual platform in Microsoft Teams. This is a challenge that we have to have a process of awareness and capacity building, both for parties and UNFCCC observers. So there is plenty of actions that we should address in terms of public participation and access to information and capacity building, many that are also part within the ACE mandate. And since I'm very short on time, I also want to highlight the importance, and not only for DSV, but for COP26 of keeping the access equitable in terms of the people who can go to these spaces. And if we move forward to a COP, either in a mixed format or in a press or on an in-person format, we have to keep in mind the access to vaccines. To have just, equitable, and freely available access is key for a successful and inclusive climate conference in the coming months. And even if this sort of gets delayed for any reason, this remains a key need for participation to be enabled. We cannot talk about a clear or equal access for participation in the climate governance if not all persons can participate due to lack of access. And for these issues, as with many others regarding climate action, there is no need for innovation. What we actually require is an approach based on justice and on human rights. And both for and for any other issue within the climate governance, these are key principles that the Paris Agreement reflects, and that to enable participation, as it is a matter of people, is something that we should keep in mind always. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, also for making the link between the importance of environmental democracy in the context of climate action and the broader circumstances that we are facing at the moment in the context of the COVID crisis. We'll give the floor to a final panelist, and we are very pleased to being joined today by a representative of the French Ministry of Ecological Transition. France has been championing the work on the promotion of public participation in international forum under the Aarhus Convention. Edouard Dossetto is the deputy lead of the head of climate change and energy management at the Ministry of Ecological Transition, and he's in charge of the follow-up of non-state actors and civil society engagement in the climate negotiations under the UNFCCC. Edouard, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, everyone, for the organization of this great meeting. I don't have a presentation to share, sorry, but I will rely on the previous presentation. So I will speak about three main topics: the action for climate empowerment that Francesca already presented, the global climate action agenda under the UNFCCC, and of course, the global stocktake to take into account civil society participation and contribution. So as Francesca already said, the ACE, Action for Climate Empowerment, is a term adopted by the UNFCCC to denote the work under the Article 6 of the Convention, and not Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and the Article 12 of the Paris Agreement. And the overarching goal of the ACE is to empower all members of the society to engage in climate action. So at COP25, we parties adopted the ACE decision with the term of reference for the review of the Doha Work Programme. And this review aims to take stock of the progress, to evaluate the effectiveness of the action, and to identify good practices and recommendations for further action. And well, now we as France, we recall the importance of including education in the fight against climate change, and we welcome the presence of non-state actors and the importance of inclusiveness of participation and contribution of the civil society in the climate negotiation, because it's crucial to fight climate change. And so I want to underline on this topic France's support for the continuation of the ACE dialogues and the support to the work to find synergies between education issues related to climate agenda and the 2030 agenda. And we just have to avoid to create a niche or a group of experts working in silos. But the implementation of the Doha Work Program and this term of reference is adopted at COP25 are really one of a big challenge to create more collaboration between parties and non-state actor, non-party stakeholder. So this is the second part of my presentation. It's another way to involve non-party stakeholders and civil society, and you maybe have already heard about it. It's the Global Climate Action Agenda. So under the leadership of the high-level climate champions, we have at the UNFCCC the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action that supports the implementation of the Paris Agreement by enabling collaboration between governments and cities, regions, businesses, civil societies. And their mission is to strengthen collaboration. So at COP25, the parties acknowledged the important role of non-party stakeholders and requested the champions to explore ways to improve the work under this Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. And the champions thought to move forward the objectives for 2020-2021, including the strengthening of collaboration and the broadening of participation and the tracking of progress, which is one of the main points we are working on for France. So about tracking, so it's tracking action of non-party stakeholders. There are 3 principal reporting and tracking vehicles: the Global Climate Action Portal that records all the action under the Marrakesh Partnership, the Yearbook, which is a periodical report about all the achievements, and the Climate Action Pathways. You have maybe heard also about the 2 siblings campaigns led by the champions. So the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience campaign. These campaigns are aims to rally the leadership and support from civil society and non-state actor for healthy, resilient, zero carbon society. So last year they gather 500 cities, 20 regions, 2,000 businesses, and 500 higher education institutions to join the Race to Zero. And for the Race to Resilience, they are catalyzing a step change in global ambition and action for climate resilience and adaptation. So they have already 20 initiatives joined to combine the action of, in order to reach over 1 billion people. So from water resilience to nature-based solution to disaster risk reduction and agriculture resilience. And all these actions have together to input in the global stocktake, which, as you know, is one of the key features of the ambition cycle of the Paris Agreement. And the GST, the global stocktake process, will formally start at the next COP26, with the information collection and the preparation phase. We will have then technical discussion during the SB session, the next SB session. And at the COP in 2023, we will deliver the outcome of the global stocktake. So the question is how non-state actors and civil society can also provide inputs through submission, for example. And this is one of the main questions of the ACB's next SB in June, to guide the way at the upcoming virtual June session, to find a way to infuse the action of and participation of civil society in the global stocktake. So we should, sorry, the source of inputs is listed in the decision 19 CMR1, paragraph 36 and 37. And the ACE actors and the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action actors should contribute in providing indication to the non-state actors to contribute to the input of the global stocktake.
Thank you, Edouard. Thank you very much for your presentation, and actually to France for all of the leadership on these issues with the support and working jointly with many other states. We're running out of time, unfortunately, as often for these web-based meetings, but I would like to give the floor to any other states actually would like to complement and share views on how you see the opportunity to promote environmental democracy, to promote public participation and inclusive decision-making in the context of the Paris Agreement. If anyone would like to take the floor, now is the time. And I see that there is one person actually in the a participant who would like to make an intervention or who raised their hand. So if we could unmute Barrett Ristroff, and if you'd like to intervene, please go ahead. You should be able to unmute yourself now. Barrett, if you'd like to speak, you can do so now. Please don't hesitate to do that in the chat. Otherwise, if anyone else would like to intervene, I really encourage you to use the remaining 4 minutes to do so. And we'd really like, Walter? I would really encourage some of you to take the floor. I know you've been, many of you have worked hard on these issues in the past. So Walter Schultz from Ecuador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you to CIEL and also Carlos Miguel from ECLAC and colleagues from the other conventions. I'm sorry because I'm participating at other meetings. As you can imagine, these times in parallel, we have several meetings, including CBD negotiations going on and other climate change consultations as well. But just to share with you our strong support to strengthen this linkage between the progress that we have in instruments such as the Aarhus Convention, the EC, and the Escazú Agreement, and how that those progress, in particular in our case from Latin America, and they enter into force on the last 22nd of April. That tool, that very important milestone of the entry into force can support and can strengthen the participation of civil society, specific groups such as women, youth, indigenous people, and communities in the process, both at the international level and national level, in terms of climate action and environmental protection. And that speaks not only on the linkages that were raised, for instance, by Carlos Miguel, with Article 6 of the Convention on Education, but also Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that you have raised, Sebastian, but also in others, in the indigenous people and communities platform on the climate change, on the response measures, on climate justice, on the constructions of the NDCs at national level, but also on the discussions on how the NDCs should be sort of homogenized in the future, for the future NDCs, the balance between etiquette and adaptations, the issue of the perspective of a base need of a needs-based approach to climate action that instead of something that is imposed from outside. And for all of that, the tools such as the Escazú Agreement and the others are fundamental, and we really look forward for a stronger implementation. We have in our case a very, very optimistic perspective with the new government that just began yesterday, and that in the opening ceremony made a very, very clear statement on the stronger role that civil society should have in all our public policies and actions, including, of course, on climate change and environmental protection. So just wanted to share that and reiterate our strong support to the strengthening of those linkages with the international processes or environmental processes at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter, for this intervention, but also for all of the work done over the past years by yourself and Ecuador to promote those principles actually in the negotiations on many of the agenda items that you've mentioned. I would like to open the floor to perhaps one final intervention. I know that we are running out of time and we all have extremely hectic schedules, so we would like to be very respectful of your time. We will be looking forward to following up after this meeting. Is there anyone wishing to take the floor? Please, Kate Wilson, you have the floor.
Good morning, Sebastian. I'm sorry that I logged in so late. There are so many other meetings happening at the same time. But we wanted to say how much we welcome, and this is St. Lucia, we welcome the efforts being made by CIEL and all the other parties, the synergies with the Aarhus Convention and the Paris Agreement, and so to see the implementation of the Escazú Agreement. What St. Lucia would really like to see the strengthening and the putting into place. I know ECLAC, the Escazú Secretariat, is doing a lot in that direction, to see the Committee on Compliance and Implementation, to see those structures put in place and strengthened, and more importantly, to see the financial provisions, the provisions for the funding that will help the implementation go along. So these are the two main areas we would like to see a lot of attention placed on, and because we believe once these two areas are strong, indeed, implementation will be fantastic. Thank you very much, Sebastian.
Thank you very much for this final intervention. We'll take good notes of this, as well as the point that is made actually in the question and answers, highlighting actually the importance, again, I guess echoing the points made by Adrian Martinez previously, the importance of actually ensuring equitable participation at the COP26 by civil society, keeping in mind the restrictions associated with COVID and the fact that this might actually make it extremely difficult for the civil society from many countries to be represented. This is something that has been systematically carried forward as a message by civil society organizations, and I know also governments, to ensure that COP26 is not organized at the cost of actually global representation of civil society and the representation of communities that are most particularly impacted. So this point is very well noted, and we will make sure to continue to echo it systematically in our interactions with the relevant decision makers. I'd like to conclude this briefing today to make sure that we can follow up with all of you actually in the coming weeks. This is hopefully only the beginning of a resuming of a conversation that took place already in the past. We look forward to working with parties. We've been extremely grateful for your time, knowing how hectic the agenda is currently. We had the representation of more than 20 parties, 20 different parties for this briefing today, which I think represents well the amount of interest and commitment there is actually across regions to those principles. I know it's really a matter of making sure that those points are reflected proactively enough in the negotiations, but also, as Walter highlighted, in the national implementation, of course, of the Paris Agreement. Today, we have focused this briefing extensively on the upcoming climate negotiations and the COP26 because of immediacy of those discussions. But the most important at the end of the day is definitely to promote public participation, inclusive governance when domestic climate plans are actually being drafted, designed, and implemented. And in relation to this, maybe I will encourage parties to really make use of, for instance, the facilitative sharing of views and the multilateral assessment to actually exchange about their experience with regards to the participation of indigenous peoples, of women, of different groups in the decision related to their climate plans. And we've noted with great interest that actually some states had been very proactive in their written questions to actually ask for more information based on the experience of some of the states that will be reviewed next month. I would like to bring this event to an end by just highlighting again how important those principles could be. And I think Carlos highlighted this in his presentation also extremely well. At the end of the day, we are all here working towards contributing to the protection of the rights of every person, present and future, to live in a healthy and sustainable environment. And public participation is a critical tool to guarantee this. And so we look forward to working with parties and stakeholders interested in the coming weeks and towards COP26 to make sure that the COP26 outcomes actually reflect fully those principles. We will be sending a very brief briefing note summarizing the discussion today, as well as the presentation from our panelists via email. Thank you so much for your time. And we wish you all those attending the virtual climate negotiations in the coming month a very enriching and productive exchange. Thank you. And thank you again to France, Uruguay, Earthjustice, and La Ruta del Clima for their support for this event.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.